Hi everyone. So I'm Sophie Artemigi and I make narrative games, and this is my talk, How to Get Banned from the App Stores. So in this talk, I'm going to tell you about a game I made 2 years ago. Then I'm going to read out an email exchange and read out the App Store and Play Store guidelines. And I promise you this is going to be interesting and informative. As game devs, we all fall in an intersection between art, tech, and business. If you work in a larger company, you're able to specialize, even if you have to know all of these disciplines. But if you work for a smaller company, you have to do all of these, and just naturally, sometimes you end up doing them badly. So I think it's important for designers and developers to have a basic knowledge of the storefront guidelines so that they're aware of the financial risks of their design choices. Okay, so here's the part where I talk to you about a 2-year-old game. This is Hookup. It's about a woman who matches with her high school bully on a dating app. You play as Alex, a sex-positive 20-something-year-old, and you snoop through her dating app, uncover the story by texting different matches, including her high school bully. And the main question is, will they or won't they hook up, which you find out as the narrative unfolds throughout the playthrough. It did really well. It debuted at #1 on the UK's paid charts on the App Store. And this was partly due to the success of a TikTok campaign, which was propped up because people really resonated with the story. And they're drawn to frank and vulnerable conversations about sex that neither glorify it nor shame people for it. And at this point, I kind of want to talk about the difference of talking about sex and talking sexually or talking in a pornographic way. And it's a fine line that people struggle with because there's a lot of overlap between the two, but they are two distinct things. So talking about sex, you can talk about it as a concept. And you can give examples of human sexuality without actively trying to arouse people. For example, I've probably said the word sex about like 7 times now, and hopefully none of you are turned on. However, talking sexually can involve the same topics, but it's usually a lot more specific. It's about specific people with specific desires to do specific sexual acts to a specific sexual end. And of course, there's overlap, and that's why miscommunication arises and is inevitable. But it's important to have your own mental distinction so that you can kind of build a framework based on that. This is going to come up later when we talk about how certain people viewed my game, just to let you know. But also, it is kind of a problem on an interpersonal level. When I was showing Hookup at events, I would get asked out, talked to inappropriately, and groped during most conferences. And some people I was close to professionally said they thought I wouldn't be their friend unless they tried to sleep with me. And I believe this happened because people got confused with my desire to talk about sex versus a desire for sex. And having the knowledge that these are two different things is very important and quite empowering in many ways. I'm also mentioning it because it's gross, and if it happens to me at this event, I'm going to make a public fuss about it. So just letting you know. Here are some examples of other media in this genre, not necessarily games. And the thing these have in common is that they're sexually open, they're queer in the sense that they're sexually deviant, not necessarily LGBTQ+, and they're vulnerable about sex. Work in this genre is very successful because it taps into a social curiosity that it is still censored due to taboo. And also another thing they all have in common is that they take female desire very seriously. When the rapper Cupcake here says in her hit song Deep Throat, lick, 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 I want to eat your dick, but I can't fuck up my nails, so I eat it up with chopsticks. She's not actually offering fellatio with chopsticks. The joke here is that that sounds really unsexy, but her sexual confidence kind of counterbalances this. And really what she's doing is bragging about her sexuality and making a joke, essentially to friends. She's not really trying to seduce anyone here. Similarly, The Piano Teacher isn't being re-uploaded on kink.com. It's a story about how BDSM doesn't really translate into normal interpersonal relationships. Additionally, The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo isn't bisexual fetishism. It's about how relationships impact our identity and how bisexuality add layers to this unconventionality. Yes, it has sex scenes to illustrate this, but they're in and of themselves not supposed to be pornographic. And also it's important to note that all of these can be found on the App Store and the Google Play Store. And so bringing it back to my game, this is to say that, yes, it did talk about sex in the game, but it was to an end and it didn't fulfill the pornographic need of things being very specific, talking about specific desires that people wanted to fulfill. I thought it was really important to talk about the dehumanization from dating apps. We treat each other on dating apps in a way that we wouldn't treat each other in any other ways. I know there's entire Instagram accounts dedicated to weird messages that people get from Bumble, Tinder, or Field. And my favorite is Beam Me Up Soft Boy, if anyone cares. And it's an interesting thing that I wanted to explore. Also, I wanted to look into queerness and queer dating. Queer romance and queer sexuality aren't fully overlapping, and that creates a sort of tension that I thought was interesting. Additionally, I just wanted to talk about sex because it's funny and strange. That's fine, in my opinion. And I didn't mention any specific fetishes because I knew they'd be censored. And I kind of regret that because I ended up getting censored anyway, spoiler alert. And I think that talking about icky kinks and the sort of way that we viscerally react to them would have been an interesting dialogue I could have started. I also wanted to talk about how childhood trauma impacts you as an adult and impacts your sexuality, even though I fully agree that sex and childhood should not necessarily mix, but it is kind of one leads on to the other. And I think these are worthwhile topics, and frankly, the popularity of my game supports my opinion. People care about these things, and it's important that they have access to media against which they can form their own opinions. So anyway, spoiler alert, my game got taken down on the Google Play Store, if you can tell by the title of this talk. And so this is the part where I'm going to read you an email exchange that illustrates the game being taken down. And I think it's important that you guys see the exact wording because I think it's more telling about the attitude of this person than any specific rule I may or may not have broken. So in August of 2022, I got a notification on the Google Play console telling me my app had violated their terms of service and needed to be taken down. I appealed and then I got this email saying they'd look into it. Enter Bianca. So she summarized that the rules I broke is that they don't allow apps that contain or promote sexual content, and also I didn't provide login information. Here's the proof that she provided for each infringement. The login screen is a mechanic. You're just supposed to button mash. And so it's frustrating because they couldn't have played the rest of the game if they hadn't button mashed. And I included the note that they needed to button mash at every point in the approval process. This one on the right is the pornographic content. Sorry, guys, I should have given you a not safe for work warning. Shield your eyes. And you may be confused which picture exactly is pornographic. Don't worry. On the console itself, they highlighted it in these red boxes you can see. These are absolutely theirs and not mine. And yes, that's the porn they mentioned. And now I'm feeling really weird about wearing a shirt that exposes my midriff. So in response, I asked, what do you mean by sexual content? Can I not talk about sex at all? Are you saying that the images are pornographic? If so, what makes them pornographic? Why do you think they're intended to be sexually gratifying? Now, when I submitted it to the App Store for review before I even launched the game, my game also got flagged, but after I asked them specific questions, they then dropped the flagging and allowed me to publish the app. So I was hoping this is what would happen there too. I then went on to describe the exact poses to kind of force her into a position where she had to admit that none of this was sexual. And it was just a woman sitting down and then fixing her hair. And also I explained that one of the images was reminiscent of the statue of Pauline Bonaparte, which anyone who goes into the Galleria Borghese in Rome can see. And therefore, I thought it would be fair game to use on the App Store. In reply, she reiterated her comments, pretty much said the same thing. And this left me feeling very frustrated and unheard. And she specifically said that the primary purpose was not artistic and therefore my images weren't protected, which frankly is so rude. And And by this point, it was very clear that no one had played the game, because if they had been able to access the apps, they would have seen the screenshots in context. And this is frustrating because, as I'll show you later, a lot of the rules mention the context of the things that they bring up. And so why would you make rules based on context if you don't allow your employees to experience the game in a way that they experience this context? Why would you have those rules in the first place instead of a blanket ban? So here's my reply to Bianca. Unfortunately, I'm not satisfied that you read my appeal emails and you continue to ignore my responses to your points. I would like to escalate this to speak with the manager. Yes, this is a Karen response, but in my defense, she was wrong in not engaging with my arguments. And this is probably because she was overworked, or she just didn't have the means to play the games, or because there was a structural issue. It's a very difficult task to moderate pornographic content, and I'm not taking away from that. And so I had a lot of sympathy for her. This is where that sympathy ends. Most of this is like quite blah, blah, blah. But if you read the last line, it says, regarding your concern about escalation, I am the highest form of escalation. Next to me is God. Do you want to see God? Let me reiterate that. Holy shit, this goes hard. I mean, is this as a threat? Is it self-aggrandizement? Is she calling herself? I don't know. And I've asked lots of people and they don't know either. There's no consensus. And I'm also mad that in my really like edgy, kinky game about sex positivity, nothing I wrote went this hard. And I'm also mad that I worked as a waitress for 4 years and never once said this to any of my customers, who were significantly more rude to me than I was to Bianca. What a waste. So feel free to take this, it's on Bianca. So did I want to see God? No, but I saw the next best thing, which was the press. I asked one of my mentors what to do, and she immediately sent me Chris Bratt's info and told me to email him, so I did. And when he messaged Google to ask for comment, they said that they no longer worked with Bianca, which probably meant that she got fired. But that's also frustrating too, because I really don't believe she's the main problem. I think she's a symptom of it. And I think what she did was wrong, but I'm not sure that firing her fixed anything. And I will show you why. Because in comes Sean. And, sorry. Basically, this is the exact same email thread, and he accepts my appeal for the sexual content, but nerfs me for profanity. Apparently, you're not allowed to use profanity or swear on the store listings or in the app, which is fucking bullshit, if you ask me, but whatever. And here's the screenshot that they added with the offending word. And honestly, I forgot that twat was a swear word. And also, especially in this context, I'm not referring to female genitalia. I meant it the way I would use boob or idiot. And I can kind of see it, because if a 4-year-old said the word twat, yes. But I really don't know where the line is, and I think that's what was really frustrating to me. And another thing is that, like, to me, based on the nature of the opaque nature of the app stores, Sean and Bianca are kind of the same entity. There's no real change. It was the same email chain. They don't have distinct email addresses. They don't even have different last names or icons or any way I can imagine them as separate people. To me, Sean is just Bianca with a fake mustache glued on. And that's really frustrating, because it's the same outcome. I don't really think anything meaningfully changed here. And so, yeah, it's very frustrating. But to be fair, I'm glad that they didn't include last names or like identifying information, because I probably would have harassed Bianca on Twitter over the "do you want to see God" thing. And I would have felt justified in that, but I understand other people would have done a lot worse for a lot less. And so I think it's good to acknowledge that there is humanity behind this on both sides, not just on the developer sides. That has nothing to do with getting banned from the App Store. I just thought it would be worth saying. And this whole thing reminded me of an episode of The Late Show that came out a while ago. And it's where Stephen Colbert was making fun of the fact that TV censors required Fox News to blur an image of the painting Nu Couché when it was sold for $1.3 million at Christie's. He then talked about his own network censors and asked them increasingly specific questions about what he was and wasn't allowed to show. Here's him reacting to the fact that he's only allowed to show the statue of David far away for 2 full seconds. And I think the facial expression here says it all. And then the censors said that if he drew 2 circles with dots in them and announced that it was a drawing of female breasts, he'd have to blur it. And the joke here is that's ridiculous. Like, it's crazy and unnecessary censorship of art. However, I appreciate that there was consistency across broadcast networks, and the censors communicated exactly what was and wasn't okay to show on TV, even if their final ruling was questionable. This contrasts with the inconsistencies of the app stores and the vagueness of their rules. I understand that the stores are fighting a losing battle. Regulating hundreds of games a day is a Sisyphean task. However, I think that artists, especially queer and marginalized artists, are also right to express their upset when they're caught in the crossfires and issues like this. So that brings us on to the bit where I read you out some rules. Who's excited for that? Okay, so here's how this is going to work. I want to start off by saying, overall, I think it's good that there's regulation. I don't think you should be allowed to accidentally access pornography whenever you download a new app. And I think that a lot of the rules regarding violence and illegal substances just make sense in general. And also, I respect their right as a private corporation to make the choices that they see fit. I understand that everyone's doing their best, and this is a very difficult job. However, there still are issues. And my problem is that the inconsistencies and the fact that the rules impact different stories make this difficult for different people more than others. So I'm going to go through every single one of the rules on content, and then I'm just going to come up with some ways that you might get unfairly penalized by accident that you wouldn't have thought of if you hadn't checked the rules beforehand. So, sexual content and profanity. We went through this a lot with my story. I just want to highlight the main issues here. What is profanity? As I said earlier, twat, boob, stupid. Where on this list is the problem? Where is the line? Where do we draw it? I'd love to know. It's a very honest and genuine question. How do you measure intent for sexual gratification? I insist that my game did not intend for sexual gratification, but they insist otherwise. What is the measure here? I'd be happy to jump through any hoops if they just told me what those hoops were. And also, what does it mean to be associated with sexually predatory behavior? Right-wingers often label drag queens under this umbrella, especially with drag queen story times for kids. Will the Play Store do this too? And how do we have any assurance that they won't? Additionally, you can play GTA San Andreas on the Play Store and the App Store through Netflix. And in that game, you can solicit sex workers and harass or run over those sex workers. Is that not associated with sexually predatory behavior? I'm not saying sex work is inherently predatory. I'm just pointing out the power imbalance and how I feel like under a lot of other circumstances that would meet the criteria. And because it doesn't really help the storyline or the mechanics, it's basically just there to reinforce the male gaze. And that kind of ties in with generally sex being policed based on the vibe rather than the actual letter of the law, which I will come back to a lot. Here are the examples that they give. And again, there are a lot of different things. Most of them we covered before in my rant about my game. But I did want to point out the last bits, which are apps that degrade or objectify people, which is really annoying because you could make a really fun Eldritch horror game disguised as an undressing game. Like, imagine a sexy character taking off her bra to reveal like eyes where her nipples should be. That would go so hard, and I would love that. But it would definitely get nerfed, which is really frustrating. Additionally, they talk about creep shots and depictions of creep shots. That's frustrating because I know in a lot of countries there's systematic problems with cameras being put in hotel rooms and motel rooms. And I think that would make a really compelling story. Would the fact that creep shots are being portrayed at all be a problem, regardless of whether the people who were being unwittingly filmed in this fictional scenario were doing sexual acts or not? These are some questions, and if you want to answer those questions, don't rely on being able to sell your app on the Google Play Store or the App Store. Here is Apple's rule. I like it a lot better because it says pretty much the same thing in one sentence and doesn't really get bogged down in the idea of suggestive poses or whatever. But at the end of the day, both of the rules are long-winded ways of saying this. It's the Jacobellis versus Ohio court case in which the famous line, "I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it," was coined. Both Apple and Google storefronts are just long-winded ways of saying pornography is based on vibes. And really, that's all any of us can say about it. I too couldn't come up with a better definition of pornography. But the problem is, if we go by vibes versus based on actual rules, it's mostly there to maintain the status quo rather than to give any objective guideline, which is frustrating, especially, as I said earlier, if you're part of a marginalized group. Basically, I want you to be aware that if your game goes against the status quo, it may be highly popular for that reason, but you should expect significant pushback from the storefronts. Okay, hate speech. This is Google's policy on it. Again, I love that I can't say slurs on the Google Play Store. I think that's great. However, they talk about EDSA, which is what theoretically protected hookup, but not in reality. And I can foresee that if you're a minority and you want to make a game about your experience dealing with hate speech or violence, or you want to talk about your own internalized bigotry, that might be a stumbling block where you get banned from one of the stores, especially the Google Play Store in this instance. And again, it's very good that hate speech is bad, and it's not certain that you will be banned if you do this. I just want to bring it up as maybe a point of tension that could happen. Here's the App Store's version on hate speech. The things I want to show off here is I don't like the mean-spirited content definition, because as a disabled woman, I reserve my right to make fun of the abled and their inability to adapt and solve problems that they cause. Also, as a queer woman, I reserve the right to be mean to straight men. And I think anyone who makes a game should do that, and I would love to play their game, especially on the App Store or the Play Store. And also, this last sentence, who is a professional political satirist? If I make a comedy game about how stupid abled people are and sell it on the App Store, do I become a professional satirist after my first sale, or do I need to have made a living off it for a few years? Many interesting things to think about. I've included these summaries throughout this, and this is mostly just so that I can remember what I was meant to say in case I miss it up. This is Google's policy on violence. The main issue here is, what is violence? For example, if a politician cuts benefits for disabled people and those disabled people respond by rioting and burning down cars, who is violent in this situation? The disabled people have not killed anyone and the politician has. However, based on vague descriptions shown here, I'm inclined to believe that they're talking about physical violence versus structural violence. And it's frustrating that a depiction of one might get you banned or subject to restrictions more than the other. Also, the allowed game violence that they mention here seems to refer to violence as mechanics, and I'm suspicious that they'd maintain their stance when it comes to violence that's portrayed more narratively than just duck hunting. Here's the App Store's version on violence, and pay specific attention to enemies within the context of a game cannot solely target a specific race, culture, real government, corporation, or any other real entity. The problem is that's not how violence works. No gang or army has a DE&I quota. They're not trying to get perfectly represented minorities in all of their violence. Violence tends to be quite tribal in the society as we know it, and it's frustrating that this can't be portrayed. And this isn't just me talking as an abstract. In 2016, the app Leela and the Shadows of War depicted violence perpetrated by the Israeli occupying forces against the Palestinians, and the app got taken down. It was reinstated that year because of public outcry. But does that mean that every game made by a victim of violence needs to have a popular following in order not to be censored? Because that in itself is a problem. So here are the main points that I've made. Again, violence extremism is its own separate thing in the Play Store. And I think the problem here is, what is terrorism and what is violent extremism? For example, the Black Panthers was considered a terrorist group by the CIA, but is now seen as a key force for civil rights in the States, looking back on the civil rights movement. Additionally, the Earth Liberation Front was an eco-terrorist organization in the 90s that burnt down deforestation infrastructure, but went to great lengths to make sure that they never hurt any humans. So would a game about them be censored? Is terror defined by civilian casualties, or is it defined by a feeling of terror that it evokes? If you're making an environmentalism game that advocates for anything stronger than litter picking, you may have an issue. For example, no matter how you feel about Just Stop Oil, I think they'd make a hilarious app game. But if you want to make your riches by producing said game, you may need to think again about that, because it may not last on the stores for a long time. This is the App Store's issue on sensitive events. One thing I want to say is that a lot of group behavior that we do would be banned on this. For example, when Margaret Thatcher died, Ding Dong the Witch is Dead topped the UK charts for 2 weeks, which would absolutely be in violation of that. And I think a portrayal or a expression of that kind of sentiment would be legitimate, even if it's kind of unseemly because someone just died. I've seen 5 people die right in front of me, and I can tell you that not all deaths are the same, and they don't all happen under the same circumstances or with the same dignity. And the idea that we have to react the same to all of them is just ridiculous. And the idea of unqualified respect for the dead is stupid. And I'm not going to back up my points, I just think it is. This also relates to COVID. And interestingly, I kind of get the sense that people don't want to talk about COVID. I mean, I've seen Bo Burnham's Inside, but I haven't really seen that much COVID-centered content after that. And so it'd be interesting to see what happens and how they get treated differently as time goes on, if more of those kinds of works of art come about. Here's Apple's version of that, which is harmful context. What is a harmful concept, and what does it mean to capitalize or seek profit? Does that mean that you can put a game if you're not trying to make money on a fit? Who's to say? Basically, these ones are difficult, especially also if you consider this in the context of the way that Gen Z and Gen Alpha humor is evolving. For example, 9/11 memes are currently in vogue, and the newer generations really want to morbidly engage in real time with current affairs when a joke is at the expense of people in power, and any game that seeks to capitalize on that sense of humor might be at risk. And so that's something you definitely have to think about when creating a mobile game. Here's Google's bullying and harassment rules. Again, I think bullying and harassment is bad, and I agree especially with their blackmail clause. But I put a picture of Elon Musk here because I think he's an example of someone who deserves to get publicly bullied. I agree, bullying is bad mostly, harassment is bad mostly. However, public humiliation is a way that we prevent harmful behavior, especially in people with a lot of money and power that the masses don't have. If you make a game that satirizes or pokes fun at a real person, then you might be blocked because of this rule. Apple specifically allows this harassment because of the satirists and humorists rules that we saw earlier, but Google not so much. Here are some more rules, and these aren't necessarily super important. The illegal or reckless use of weapons is interesting because technically most FPS games would ruin this. And I think that kind of backs up my point about the status quo that I said earlier. If you reskin Fortnite, you're probably going to be fine. But if you want to do anything more artistic or interesting with it, proceed with care. Again, more illicit things. I don't think anyone's going to try and use their games to sell CBD oil. And if they do, why are you in the games development industry? I want to talk about the religious inflammatory content, because what does that mean? Everything is inflammatory. That's why there are so many factions of Christianity, because they were all inflamed by each other's interpretation of the Bible. Again, this leads back to maintaining the status quo. If you want to make a game about a religious text, proceed with caution and try not to offend anyone. Yes, so quickly before this ends, I want to talk about Apple versus Epic. And I think this reinforces the idea that the status quo isn't just me over analyzing the rules because I'm salty. You can see them showing their real sides when it comes to legal opinions. So during the court battle, Apple argued that its tight control over the apps in its store was important because it prevented games like ones on itch.io from being submitted. It pointed at a game such as Sisterly Lust, which as far as I understand is an incest porn game with explicit sex scenes. I'm frustrated why they didn't just say that they didn't want porn on their store. Phrasing it like this suggests that without a tight grip on the storefront, it's a slippery slope into total degeneracy. And this is a very sex-negative opinion. It's not a binary between puritanical sexlessness and hardcore incest porn. There is definitely a middle ground. And Apple knows this because, as I showed you earlier, you can get a lot of media through App Store apps which explore themes of sexuality without being pornographic. It's frustrating to watch them moralize when it's convenient to them and then turn their backs on creators when it's not. Also, a lot of journalists rightfully picked up on the fact that Apple's attach on itch.io was also queerphobic. If someone challenged me to a race to find a game I'd never played with a queer protagonist as fast as possible, I'd immediately go to itch.io. I think everyone in this room was. And in that article, Stacey Henley shows that itch is a haven for LGBTQ content in a way that Apple, Google, and Apex will never be, no matter how many rainbow flags they post during Pride Month. In my mind, there's this weird horseshoe effect. Homophobes really over-sexualize queer people and are disgusted by gayness because they see it as deviant and sexualized fetish. On the other side, you've got socially liberal companies that accept queerness because they've completely desexualized it. Most of the queer content on itch is not pornographic, but Apple's referral to the platform as hosting vile games shows that as a corporation, they do not see the distinction. For queerness to be accessible, then it must be desexualized to them. But sex is a part of queerness that cannot be surgically extracted because it's profitable. It must be engaged with. So these are some takeaways I wanted to give at the end of the talk. Hopefully I've given you some food for thought, but I just wanted to focus on some points that you can think about more. So are games art? The App Store doesn't run their storefront like art galleries. They run it like in-flight shopping magazines or news networks. That's fine, but it creates friction when game devs that populate those shopping magazines or news networks consider their work to be art. So what does this mismatch mean on a larger scale? Additionally, does it even matter? At the end of the day, the most important thing for Google and Apple is their bottom line. How much money, how many sales can they make without bringing in more lawsuits? Is it naive of us to expect them to protect our freedom of expression when they are a private company with a bottom line? Additionally, can these tech oligopolies ever serve our interests? Should we as game developers put up with this bleak, profit-driven view of games? Wouldn't we make better games and more interesting games if we felt empowered to make more boundary-pushing experiences? We exist in this weird intersection of having the megalomania of tech bros and the community-mindedness that comes with creating an experience for our audiences. Aren't we really perfectly primed to create a community-governed alternative that protects the public from harmful and hateful content whilst protecting freedom of expression? In fact, the European Union's digital market laws have forced Apple to allow people to download apps without the App Store. So now it's really the perfect time to create a competitor to Google and Apple. Can't we dream of a better future, essentially? The last point was a commie pipe dream, and isn't going to happen, but I liked saying it, so sue me. But we do have no clue what will happen. The rules on each store may change drastically over the next decade. New app stores may emerge. Generative AI's popularity may cause the rules to change because the way AI interacts with rules at all is different from the way humans interact with it. So who knows what's going to happen? And so essentially, everything's crazy, but it's going to be crazy in a different way in the future. And that's kind of exciting if you think about it. So this was how to get banned from the App Store. I'm now going to open the floor to questions and also remind you that after this talk, you should rate this talk and tell everyone that I was very pretty and talented. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
Great talk, thank you. Great talk, thank you. You're honing in on the fundamental tension of like creative expression and societal norms, which is not new, right? Yep. But it's a new medium and we're experiencing it. I wonder if, as you've obviously done such a deep exploration of it, have you thought back to like the fight over comic books in the 40s and 50s, or even early radio shows, or even Victorian theater? And like, how do you see those echoes and parallels?
Yeah, I tried to touch on that when I was talking about The Late Show. And I think that there's always going to be that tension, but it's strange. It seems to be an upward spiral. For example, most music videos that I see today, regardless of the genre, would have been obscene back in the day, especially when you're talking about the comic book wars in the 40s. And there is a sense of progression, even though this is the same argument we've had for years and years and years. And I think that as we move towards a more queer, openly queer society, especially in that area, there will be more to work on. But I've also noticed this kind of trend of queer people reaching the upper echelons of tech and then reinforcing the oppressive structures that have caused problems for them. You know, Apple is run by a queer man, and a lot of these problems I talked about were on the App Store. And so I think the key issue here is figuring out how to continue this evolution and continue this progress, whilst also being really mindful of our responsibility to our communities and how we can make things easier for the people who come after us. Yeah, thanks. Well, in that case, let's all have a nice late lunch. Thank you very much for coming.